I'm here with Bruce Philp, who's the author of Consumer Republic, Using Brands to Get What You Want, Make Corporations Behave, and maybe even save the world. And this is a book that, to a certain degree, is a bit of a response to Naomi Klein's No Logo or Joel Bakken's The Corporation. So, no further ado, I'll ask you, Bruce, what led you to write the book?
Well, I think latent in me was a need to respond to particularly to No Logo, because that book came out at in 2000, and that was a much more sunny time in marketing than today is, and I felt it was an incomplete look at the issue. But what triggered it really was this collapse that started in 2008, because unlike previous recessions that I'd experienced, this one was causing people to ask questions about the morality and the ethics of consumption. In as much as this recession was less the consumer's fault than any previous one had been, it seemed to raise more doubt about whether they were complicit in the system. I thought this was a teachable moment, and at a point in my own career when I could afford to step out and say, let me tell you what I know from the other side of the glass.
Some people look upon corporations, and I mentioned Joel Bakken, as being psychopathic in that they have this insatiable need for profit, and they're also, the directors are guided by fiduciary duty that their primary and sole responsibility is to generate returns for their owners, the investors. You, on the other hand, compare a corporation to a cow, and I'm wondering where that came from.
Well, I mean, first of all, that definition works for corporations that sell branded products to consumers. I'm not going to, I think it would be irresponsible to generalize this way about a big industrial chemical company or something like that, where the market dynamics aren't the same. But my contention is that the kinds of corporations we're talking about can't exist without our complicity and without our approval, and they can't create shareholder value without those things either. A. And B, I also know that the power of corporations to manipulate us is far less than we like to think it is. And I sometimes believe that consumers are inclined to characterize corporations this way because it sort of lets us off the hook. I don't think we should be off the hook. There may be evil people in corporations. There may be corporations that are culturally evil, but at the end of the day, I think, as I say at one point in the book, even biker gangs need satisfied customers to stay alive.
Well, you look at a couple of corporations that ran into trouble last year. You had BP with the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. You also had Toyota with all those recalls they had, both big branded companies that require consumer goodwill. How would you assess their handling of that situation, those situations?
Well, I think there are two different answers there. In the case of BP, as I mentioned in the final chapter of the book, they ended up becoming the poster child for this disaster, for which they have lots of culpability, because they were the only actor in it that had a consumer brand. 10,000 filling stations in the U.S. pumping 2 billion gallons a year into American gas tanks. They were the 80th most valuable brand in the world. They had a lot to lose, and I think that certain elements in the press and in the White House knew that and saw a great way to engage people, exactly the way Naomi Klein did, by pointing not at some abstract entity of a corporation, but rather pointing at a sign that we all stand under while we're filling our cars up. And that got action. It got people engaged in a morally simple way, and it got the corporation, terrified into doing something about the problem, which they might or might not otherwise have felt compelled to do. So BP handled it badly in some respects, and Tony Hayward was pretty awful, I think, in the job.
Yeah, the CEO.
The CEO, and was quite appropriately, literally sent to Siberia after the whole thing had cooled down a little bit. In Toyota's case, a couple of interesting things about the story. One was that it was popular to say that Toyota's brand was in great peril during this disaster. The truth is quite the opposite. When they were facing Congress in March of 2010, Gallup published some polling data that said that 3/4 of Toyota owners had absolutely undiminished confidence in their cars or in the company, even going through what they had gone through. And you could see on internet forums and the places where people gather to talk about these things that there was a lot of confidence Toyota would do the right thing. And I think that's the essence of this whole argument, that people knew that Toyota knew what was at stake. And based on the previous decades of experience with the way the culture of that company works, people were saying Toyota's not going to sleep until this is solved. I actually feel like I've got some insurance because their brand is so valuable to them. And they, in turn, understanding that narrative very well, were relatively kind of humble and responsive and did big expensive things and most importantly, patiently waited until the facts vindicated them, which in many cases they did. Speaking here of the sudden acceleration issue. I think they handled it very well. And
what can consumers do to modify corporate behavior if they disapprove of their conduct?
That's a great question. Once upon a time, all we could do was just not buy their products, and that's a fairly blunt instrument. It's hard for a company to read that behavior, and by the time they get the intelligence, it was months later. Now, marketplace intelligence is quick and accurate, as the Walmart anecdote demonstrates. And the other thing is we now have a lot of two-way media channels through which we can publicly express our disappointment or our joy if we happen to have any. And at the moment, at least, corporations are deeply invested in surveilling that environment. They want to know what people are saying about them. They're as obsessive about it as high school kids. And so we're at a moment where one person can say one grumpy thing on Twitter and get a direct message from a multi-billion-dollar corporation trying to take the conversation offline to deal with it.
Well, actually, you had something in your book about HSBC in England.
Right.
Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, that was one of the first organized social media uprisings against a brand. And the story is essentially that HSBC had made a policy change around fees relating to student lines of credit in the UK. And a student at a university organized a group on Facebook to protest that, saying that it wasn't fair that they had made this change and that the way they deployed it was insensitive. And kind of it was the first time that this platform had been used against a big corporation. And it ended happily. HSBC changed their minds and instituted the former policy and to the benefit of students, and so it went. And what's significant about this was that, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember these numbers correctly, but I think only about 8,000 people had signed up for this page. And in the scheme of things, that's not, HSBC is a giant global institution. So we have to stand back and say it didn't take a lot of pitchforks and torches to get their attention and make them act. And it's become kind of a proto case for many such things since.
One of the concerns I think a lot of our readers have is consumption leading to environmental havoc, and you look at the emission of greenhouse gases, and how much faith do you have in the planet surviving in the face of these corporations flooding the market with goods?
Yeah. It's clearly not sustainable. Going all the way back to, in as much as environmentalists, back to Rachel Carson have been saying this can't continue, the corporate world has similarly on some level understood this. The Club of Rome has been arguing we got to stop figuring, we got to figure out how to stop growing pretty soon before we can anymore. My view is a little more pragmatic in the sense that I don't think we're going to stop consuming. Consumers are not, humans aren't capable of denying themselves like that unless they're forced, usually at the point of someone's gun. Nor is it sustainable to keep going the way we have been. So the book says, in as much as what we have in our driveways, what we have in our living rooms has an impact on the world as we use it, we have to remember that the greater impact usually lies in the making of those things, in industrial activity, industrial economic activity, in the factories that spew this stuff out, and the mines that produce the nickel for the batteries, and so on and so forth. So my argument is, why don't we do two things? Let's buy less stuff, but let's buy better stuff. Instead of rebelling against corporations by denying them your money, be really judicious about giving it to them, but insist on quality. Because I think it's inarguable that if I buy a great toaster and it lasts me 10 years, versus buying a cheap toaster that lasts 2 years, if I buy the cheap toaster, I've essentially quintupled the size of the market for toasters, and the concomitant impact manufacturing those things had on the environment. So in effect, I'm saying we may end up creating more profit margin by behaving this way, but will make buying a more valuable and important occasion that corporations are forced to treat with more respect if they're going to continue to create value for their shareholders.
And what are the biggest misconceptions among the public when it comes to consumer brands? The big companies like Procter & Gamble that own these consumer brands.
I think the biggest one is that people believe brands are created by evil geniuses in laboratories and used to manipulate us. And I think that the truth is that the value of a brand is partly assigned to it by the people who buy it. And that may be variably true. It may be less true of laundry detergent than it is of a car or a pair of blue jeans. But the fact remains that brands have social meaning, and a lot of their value is tied to that social meaning. And it's not them that gives it that social meaning, it's us. So we can quite simply destroy billions of dollars worth of market capitalization by deciding something isn't cool anymore, and it's happened.
Well, thank you very much. I've been speaking to Bruce Philp, the author of Consumer Republic, Using Brands to Get What You Want, Make Corporations Behave, and maybe even save the world.